thank you for joining us, those of you who are listening in. I'm Saber Ibrahim, co-founder of Chinstrap Community. My partner and co-founder is Heather Meeker. Chinstrap Community is a resource center for founders, investors, people in the university ecosystem, and anyone else who is interested in commercial open source software. We provide programming, resources, workshops, content, guidance, and training. Our goal is to promote commercial open source as well as open source as a whole. We are here with Willy Lulciuc. And I'm sorry, did I pronounce that correct here?
You did it beautifully. That's exactly how you say it.
Okay, great. Uh, we are here with Willy Lulciuc, and he is the founder and CEO of Oleander. Oleander provides a platform for data lineage, which is the origin, the movement, the transformation of data throughout its life cycle. And basically what it does is it unifies telemetry, lineage, and model evaluation with AI reasoning. And through that, you can achieve, users achieve real-time visibility and autonomous intelligence in their machine learning training pipelines. So Willy's journey began when he co-founded the open source projects Open Lineage and Marquez. And both of those are now Linux Foundation projects. And those projects form the foundation for Oleander. Willy founded Oleander about a year ago, and that extends the functionality of Open Lineage and Marquez for the advanced needs of enterprises. And he launched the company with a friends and family round, and he is now raising a pre-seed round. So, once again, thank you, Willy, for sitting with us and for sharing your journey. And we'll dive right into that, if that's okay.
Absolutely. And also thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining. So, Willy, how did you come to be interested in the challenge of tracking data lineage?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Really, it started probably way back, like even before I joined WeWork. I was working for a few startups out in New York. So I was working for Canary, which was an IoT company, and we were doing a lot with sensor data. So storing a lot of that sensor data and building different products on top, like alerting. So if your camera detects something, or there's sensors that detect your air quality, temperature, and humidity. That was my first time where I really saw big data. Prior to that, I was doing like some smaller gigs, but this was significant amount of data. And the one thing that was a challenge was really understanding where the data sets were. Like, if there was a report that came in, there was like, a lot of time with these cameras, you have to detect if there's a crime, the police, you would get these requests, and we would have to index where those videos were. And that was actually a very challenging thing, which I was never able to solve, or at least at the time it was, this was like 10 years ago now or more. Things like data democratization, data catalogs, data lineage was not in my lexicon. That's something I didn't know about. And then I moved to BounceX, which behavioral marketing software. Similar challenges. We were doing ad marketing, or we were pretty much all the things that you would get from Amazon, cart replenishment. You get an email. We would have all this clickstream data coming in, and it would be stored in our warehouse at the time. GCP, what's GCP's BigQuery, right? And we had this same problem where we would have to figure out where the data was. It wasn't until I went and met Julian Ledem, who was at WeWork, and they were building the next gen data platform, where he talked about data lineage and understanding dependencies between data applications and the data sets that they produced and consumed, understanding the schema, the relationships between downstream teams that rely on your data. And if you change your data or your schema in some way, that has dramatic impact. So that's when the vocabulary really, really started coming about. And I realized this is where I should be. And that's when I joined WeWork and started working on Marquez. And at the time, it was just the metadata layer. But that's really the story. I didn't know there was a solution or even the vocabulary on how these problems were talked about. And it wasn't until I met Julian Ledem, where he's been in the industry for a very long time, and work alongside him to work on these open source projects.
And with the rise of machine learning and generative AI and sort of the mainstreaming of that technology, it seems like you the application for the technology that you were already working on just kind of exploded. Is that right?
I would say yes to that. More is, the common thing that you hear a lot is garbage in, garbage out. So if you train your when you train your model, a lot of it depends on the quality of your data sets. So it just became a natural extension to start using Lineage to bridge the gap between a few friction points. One is the data engineer that really builds the data sets. Then you have the data scientists as well who start curating them and preparing them for the ML engineer. So you have all those different teams that have handoffs, and where Lineage really comes in is understanding one, if you have a feature store, how using column lineage to understand how those features are used, or how are they computed and how they uh, are used in your model training, and then capturing hyperparameters. So a lot of the things that you see in data processing, run args, input outputs. You then, if you do an overlay and to the ML training world, you have run args, but they're hyperparameters. You have run information, but they're now um, they're now more like I produce a model version, and here is the input data sets that I used to train that model. So one of the key things at Oleander is we're extending the open lineage spec to start capturing metadata in the ML training pipelines.
Well, that sounds great.
Mhm.
Really interesting area that you're focusing on, and I think of huge interest to people who are involved in machine learning training, definitely. Um,
Mhm.
so, as you were figuring out the market need, how did you then make the transition to thinking about open source and creating Open Lineage and Marquez as open source projects?
Yeah, and I'll start with Marquez because Marquez came first. Um, well, the initial inception of the idea, so Julien Ledem and Laurent Paris, they used to work together at Yahoo, so they understood the data challenges. And when they met, so Laurent Paris became the CTO of WeWork, and then Julien Ledem was the principal data architect. So I was just fortunate to kind of join a team that they've been thinking about this problem a lot. And when they look back on their journey, they realized lineage was never a solved problem. Everyone sort of talked about it as like a tough thing a tough thing to provide a solution for. Um, so that's when they said, okay, if we're going to build the next gen data platform at WeWork, it should have lineage at the core. So understanding all the dependencies between teams and really build a graph of the data platform. So Julian and I, we got together and we put together a model of what the backend model would look like. So you have jobs, data sets, runs, inputs and outputs, and then there was a versioning layer on top of the metadata. And that I wrote a paper and that became shared, Slack, LinkedIn, all these big data companies around, or these big orgs within the Bay Area started providing feedback, and they're like, you're on the right track. So we incubated Marquez for about 2 years at WeWork. We worked heavily to integrate it into Airflow, so our scheduler that we were using to capture uh, data pipeline metadata. And then after a short while, we realized WeWork was not going to work out for various reasons. And then we started Datakin, and that was an operational data lineage startup. So I was the founding engineer. Laurent and Julian became the co-founders. And about 6 months in, we realized that if we wanted to extract lineage metadata from Airflow, from Spark, from all these data processing applications and frameworks, there need to be a standard. And the main reason was if you do an integration for one, if there's a version, obviously when you release a new version of a framework, things break. So we realized there needed to be a common communication layer on how lineage metadata was communicated. And that's when uh, we started proposing open lineage.
And what made you decide that those should be open source as opposed to proprietary?
Oh yeah. So and I think for me, it had a lot to do with. I mean, for me, I loved open source. This was only going to work if you had buy-in. So if you had this proprietary, I mean, with Marquez, it could have been proprietary, but we wanted WeWork to be viewed as a tech company. We wanted it from day one to be an open source project to get feedback. So we worked with Stitch Fix for a little while to build out the product, and you kind of need that collaboration. And with Open Lineage, when it comes to a standard, it was only going to work if other organizations helped out and provided feedback on the spec. The one thing that we did agree on was what the core entity was, the core models, so jobs, runs, and then data sets. And then after that, if you wanted to integrate into Spark, which I've worked on for a couple years at Apple, you needed a way to then extend it. And the extensibility part of it is a very key thing. And I don't think we were trying to monetize that aspect of it. We benefited from the open source projects growing and being successful as well.
That's great. And then those projects eventually became part of the Linux Foundation. So tell us about the process that you experienced when moving the projects over to Linux Foundation and any challenges or benefits that you saw from that.
Mhm. Absolutely. I wish I could tell you there was a lot of challenges. I think for us, we were it was before we did DataCan. I think it was a few months prior to that. Julian, who's been in part of the Apache Foundation for a very long time, he's done Arrow, he's done Parquet, so he's been at PMC for a lot of these projects. Uh, he heard about this LSAI and data initiative, and at the time, I think there was 2, 3 projects. But the one key things that was different was you could use your existing repo. So all the commit histories and discussions, they didn't have to be moved over to this incubating repo, which was nice. So that's one less friction point. The process itself was also fairly easy. You sort of present the open source project to the board. There's sort of the LFAI and data have their own voting process. And then once you get accepted, it's like, okay, look at the growth. We see the adoption. There's a healthy commit history, so healthy um, uh, development of the project. You then you're incubating, but you don't have to change your code or your code base or anything like that. They provide your Slack channel, and they give you about a year to then move up and start into the graduation process. But there are key things that are needed to graduate. But the whole process was fairly seamless, and naturally we did that with Marquez. Or I'm sorry, we did it with Marquez, so naturally we looked at the same process for Open Lineage.
Great, great.
Now, you mentioned earlier that Open Lineage and Marquez were the 4th and 5th project in the Linux Foundation's AI and data category. Now, obviously, due to the rise of the mainstreaming of AI and machine learning, there are many, many more projects in that category. So, I mean, you guys were trailblazers in that regard. Can you talk about the open source trends that you've seen in the evolution of that category within the Linux Foundation?
Yeah, we do see a lot more of well, there was a huge spike of catalogs, so data catalogs that made its way in. I think Munson from Lyft was part of the LFEI and data. Recently, Unity catalog from Databricks, but more of these observability or metadata specific applications, but also different standards for storing data as well. So we're starting to see more AI specific projects and frameworks for training. So that's the type of trend that we're seeing as well. Off the top of my head, I can't think of too many. But if you look at the list, there's a growing list that's there. But just with the AI wave, you're starting to see more of those type of frameworks.
And what have you seen in terms of how do you see that as having an effect on both being affected by the open source nature of these projects as well as affecting the open source movement? Wanted to get your thoughts kind of on that aspect of it.
Um, what do you mean by effect? With the growth of these type of projects, or
Yeah, I mean, the fact that these projects are open source, that and that's kind of becoming the norm in this area. Uh, I wanted to get your thoughts on, you know, just how the fact that these projects are open source is affecting their growth and evolution, as well as how that is shaping the open source movement as a whole.
Yeah, I have some strong opinions on this. I think so when a project was open source initially, there wasn't usually a commercial backing behind it. It used to be just there was this big company that had these challenges and then they open source a project, but it's usually Apache 2, right? And there was no commercial arm that was then driving the development. I think over the years, what we've seen is a lot of these organizations, they open source a project, but really it's they're sometimes the only ones contributing to the open source itself. But it's really a bigger component into their go-to-market strategy. So I don't know how I feel about that approach. I mean, I understand that organizations need to, they need to have a profit and stuff. But when I was first doing open source in the Bay Area, it used to just feel really cool. It's like, oh man, what project are you working on? Oh, what is the contributions? Who's using your open source project? I think nowadays it's become a path to revenue. And I don't know if that quite answers your question, but that's just sort of my view on how we've seen sort of this massive influx of open source projects that may not be solving a broader problem. It's just more of a go to market strategy.
Now, I guess that's actually a pretty good segue into what I wanted to ask next. And what are some of the challenges that you observed that led you toward the opportunity of building a business around Open Lineage and Marquez, namely Oleander?
Yeah, it was actually a number of years of working with big organizations and understanding that they're willing to put about 6 months or more of development time to put together a stack that ingests these lineage events that have an array of information. It's very, very rich metadata and then building a compliance story around that. So when you're in a big org, one of the big things is GDPR. So really, where's your data? Who's touching it? Also, if we need to delete data, we need to understand where user data is. So that relationship actually is what Open Lineage provides, but Marquez is the back end consumer. So that provides also the catalog of where your data is and provides a rich lineage API. So I started seeing that becoming more and more of a thing. The Walmarts, the Apples, they were adopting Open Lineage. So for me, when I was working at Astronomer, we built that Astro Observe, and we realized the effort that was required to get up and running to start adopting Open Lineage. So with Oleander, our V0 was just how do we get to the point where instead of spending 6 months hiring 4 engineers, getting it down to less than 5 minutes, and that's what we did. Our first was let's compress the stack, let's provide an endpoint that gives you ingestion, and then built a lot of these common um, different features that you would expect. So anomaly detection. Are you processing more bytes, writing more bytes, and getting alerts? And then same thing with average duration of your run. These are basic one-on-one things that we wanted our product to have from day one.
Gotcha. And the synergistic aspect of that in terms of you have Open Lineage and Marquez, which are open source projects and
Mhm.
use them, anybody can benefit from them. And then you have Oleander, and the two kind of, feed off each other. Um, I wanted to get your thoughts on how the benefit that you see has accrued to each as a result of that.
Yeah, the one thing that we are committed to is one continue. So the fact that we're using Lineage, so I think you're familiar with Open Telemetry. Um, we also ingest Open Telemetry as well. So we're building a telemetry lake. That's our key thing. The telemetry lake was very heavily influenced by the Marquez model that we've improved, and we're going to contribute back upstream to the Marquez project. So, and then same thing with Open Lineage. We're extending the Open Lineage spec to start handling ML pipeline or training pipelines, and that's also something that we have an issue for. We're working on a prototype for ML Flow to start building out the integration and showing the relationships between your raw data sets, how they get transformed, and eventually how they're used in your model training. But we're going beyond that. Not only do we have this observability layer, but now we're starting to work on compute. So if you want to submit a Spark job and start using the data sets that are in your telemetry lake to process your telemetry data, you're able to do that as well. So we're building this open lake that you can store your raw data sets that could be private or public, and then use Spark to execute and process that data. But you get observability out of the box. We just happen to be the team that was building Marquez and Open Lineage. Those are very core things to our product, but that's not the only thing that we're focusing on. There's a lot more that we're building out.
Well, so you have done a great job of growing your community around Open Lineage and Marquez. What would you tell new commercial open source software founders about that? What strategies did you use to grow your community and your contributor base, particularly at the beginning?
Yeah, that's probably the most difficult part. Um, I think with any open source project, you have to advocate, and you're not from day one. You're not going to get contributors. You're not going to get interest right away. So you have to be the one advocating the idea. And sometimes you might talk about things that are not implemented just yet. You have to provide the vision of where the project is going, but you have to pretty much do a roadshow, go to conferences, talk to as many people as you possibly can about the project. And that's no different than if you're doing like a startup or trying to sell an idea. You have to advocate. And you also have to be okay doing it for maybe 2-3 years. The traction might not exist in the early stages, but you have to keep at it. Then within the community itself, you do have to set sort of guidelines on how to communicate. That's also a very important part. Any contribution is accepted. Sometimes you might disagree, but you have to focus on what is this PR trying to do? Is it improving the project? It might not be to the standard that I care about. I mean, that I accept. Um, so you have to remove yourself from what the code might look like and focus more on this person in their free time. They're fixing a bug or trying to do a contribution, and guide them and feel like they have an ownership of key parts of the project, whether that's documentation or tests. But no, it could be a very long process, and you have to advocate for sometimes a couple of years.
Oh, that's great. So if someone contributes something and it's not up to your standards, what do you do about that then?
Just like a code quality and stuff. The one thing that's important is definitely there can't be long periods in between communication. So if someone's responding, you have to respond right away. In a way, there was periods where I think I would constantly monitor the Slack channel. If anyone had interest, I would respond, and then they would take like a week or two before they get back to you. Uh, but get it to the point where it's enough where the the quality itself may be 80%. I don't know. I'm just kind of making something up. But get to the point where if someone's going to contribute to the code or build on top of it, they they can improve it, or they at least understand. Um, but it's mostly focusing on what's the important part, which is the feature or the bug fix itself.
So, in your company, like you have your open source projects at Linux Foundation, which is um, not every company does something like that. Some of them run their own projects. So, because you have this separate umbrella that your projects are under, what have you had to do to establish your brand identity for your company and the separation between those things?
No, I think that's something that's a good question, actually. That's something we're still working on. Even though we have some of the original contributors, Julian Ladem, who's the project lead of Open Lineage and also our technical advisor. Um, if you search Open Lineage or if you search Marquez, you're not gonna see us. And I think that's also part of a difficult thing in the open source. You don't want to come into a community that has been built around just open collaboration and then come in as a commercialized product and be like, okay, now start using us. So I would say it's a very delicate thing. I think for me, I've been reaching out to people in Slack. It's like, hey, we're building something. We love your feedback, but it's a lot of it. We like your feedback, and if they do like the product, they could start using it. But there's a balancing act between forcefully going in and saying, "We're now the commercial product behind that." And, that's a balance that I think I've struggled with quite a bit, because it took years to build those communities. And, I think it's difficult to go back in and say, "Okay, now start now start paying us for, uh, for those open source projects." But, I think for us, we're so far beyond what Marquez was doing, and also with Open Lineage, we're just using that as an ingestion, standard, that it's actually okay. We go to the community meetings, we kinda give updates on where we're taking the standard for the ML use case, and we're the ones leading that effort. So I think that's a good way to give back to the community, is sort of extending and working on some of these other integrations.
That's really great, and you touched on something that I think is significant. How have you gone about communicating to your community that the existence of Oleander and the paid commercial products of Oleander actually serve as a value add for the community as a whole, and the fact that Oleander exists as a commercial entity is of benefit to the entire community of Open Lineage and Marquez, even those who
Mm,
have become paying customers. How do you go about
mm.
communicating that message to the community?
Yeah, I think for open language, it's a lot easier, because you have Datadog, you have these data catalogs for some of these big organizations, like AWS and GCP, contributing to different parts of the standard. So and also with open language, we're with Oleander, we're coming in and working on the different component of the standard. So communicating the benefit isn't as difficult. With Marquez, that's a bit more challenging because some of there are feature gaps in Oleander. I mean, in Marquez that exists in Oleander. Um, but the way we communicate it is that the Marquez project is not going away because we're funding a lot of the development and improvements in the model, and that we're going to contribute back. Um, if some want to start testing out Oleander, and I think that's great. But for us, we're kind of saying this project is backed by the original team, and there's a commitment to getting releases every month and reviews on PRs, which at times is actually very difficult because you're spread thin. Um, I'm not sure if I answered the question though, to be honest with you. But is there any part of that you want me to go a little bit deeper in?
No, no, I think that that's very helpful.
Mhm.
I mean, basically, the point that we're trying to make is that when we advise commercial open source companies, I think the message, because you're right. I mean, there's often that tension, right? That we have this community that we've built up over very many years, and all of a sudden there's now this commercial entity, and that can be perceived any number of ways. And I think that conveying the message to the community that the existence of the commercial entity and its commercial activities are actually of net benefit to the community because they add all of this value, even for those who don't become paying customers. So I think
Mhm.
that communicating, like, the messaging of that is has to be, done in a proper way. And I just wanted to
Mhm.
hear your thoughts on that aspect of it.
Yeah, and I think there was these open source to companies that also then go public are very few. So Confluent is one example. I forgot when and what year, but there was even with Databricks, right? They had Spark, and then they commercialized that. Uh, and as you start raising, especially in the early days for us, the open source to um, uh, a private company around an open source project is also not as interesting anymore. To be honest with you, I mean, was it Flight that came out of Lyft? That team started their own company around that open source project. So there are all these companies that get funded around that, and for Oleander, we didn't want to be we're the company behind these two open source projects because we can't own the standard. And with Marquez, we're leveraging all the learnings from previous experiences at Astronomer, scaling Marquez, and also what we've seen at Apple, and taking those learnings and applying them to Oleander. And then once we reach a certain scale and understanding more on how we fine tune the model, we're going to contribute that back. But the life cycle is usually about 3 to 6 months. So there, naturally, you want some sort of advantage, right? But and also in production use, and then we contribute it back.
Very cool. So with Oleander, how did you go about developing your revenue model and deciding upon pricing for your paid offering?
Yeah, I think we're still figuring that out as well. I mean, we wanted to at least make it simple. Um, since we're so early on, a lot of our pricing strategy does come from customer feedback. So it's usually with paid pilots and doing development and feature development based off what our customers are looking for. But we wanted to make it simple, almost like a slider. So it's all event based. So the first 3,000 events, they're free, and then there's different tiers. So there's hobby, there's pro, and then pro plus plus. So there's different models there. Um, but in the end, it's just event based. That's how we do it. So the more events that you ingest, um, you just kind of scale up that way. The reason that we did that was in an open range event, you get a snapshot of all the details of how your data application is processing the data. So there's a lot of rich metrics there, especially if you're using Spark with Iceberg. There's so much telemetry data that we're able to collect from the input and output tables, especially around partitioning and column lineage, that we feel pretty strongly that, if for one event, we could charge you an X amount, which we're still figuring out, but there's so much detail in one event, which for us, I think we could charge more on the higher end for that.
Okay, great. Sort of shifting gears a little bit, but continuing with the theme of the commercial end. You're currently raising a pre-seed round for Oleander. How do you think that being a cost company is important to that process? I presume that you're talking to investors who have a variety of different, backgrounds in terms of investing in closed source companies and open source companies, or maybe they've never invested in a commercial open source company. So, in what way does Oleander's status as a commercial open source company come up in conversation potential investors?
Oh, it comes up a lot, right? The richness and also the richness in the community, but also the adoption is a very key part. Because a lot of times, how successful can you be based off all the possible customers that you can talk to that are using Open Lineage or using Marquez. So that's a metric that they use. If you have X amount of stars, which is unfortunate, but if you have X amount of stars in your repo, that shows you're solving a real problem. So if a number of organizations or a number of different companies are using your standard or using Marquez, that shows a true need or maybe missing piece in the data infrastructure ecosystem. So it's a very strong signal, and it does come up quite a bit.
So when you talk to investors, um, showing them, GitHub stars and the number of contributors you have and the strength of your community, you found that actually does move the needle with them in terms of.
Yeah, no, it's a very strong validating signal. They also don't, you have to think about an open source project. What is the lifespan? Sometimes you see hyper growth and then all of a sudden it starts tapering off. So that's also a key thing. How long has the open source project been around? Who's been contributing and at what point within the life cycle of or the life of the open source project? So for us, I think one of the key things for Open Lineage was Microsoft got involved very, very quickly. So they started advocating very heavily around Open Lineage. And then shortly after, we saw AWS, and then eventually Google started contributing. So the fact that those three big cloud providers are adopting the standard, that was a very strong signal.
No, that's really great. And you found that to be because, with particularly with investors who don't have a lot of experience investing in open source, we found that, and thankfully this is changing, but we found that there is, maybe some lingering skepticism that, well, you're built on a project, you're built on something whose source code is available for all. So
Mm.
how can you monetize? Like, what's your, how is that even possible? But, it's good to hear that there's powerful counterpoints there.
Yeah, I think a lot of it validates. So when a pre-seed round, a lot of the investment is like, okay, who's the team? What have they built already? Do I buy their vision? And that's like the very key thing. In the end, the product and then the pricing model, we're gonna figure that out. But are you a team that can deliver and also has the background to justify the investment? I think that's a very important part. Now with the open source stuff, like I was saying with stars and adoption, that doesn't always lead to customers as well. So there's also a big risk there. Um, so I wouldn't say that, oh, just the fact that you've seen growth in the open source projects, that means you're going to get an investment. I think it just provides a validation on who you are as a person and how you're able to take an idea and get it all the way to, get it to the point where now you see broader adoption. That's all about execution. So that's sort of my answer was more around that. There's still a struggle. I mean, yeah, just because you might have thousands of users doesn't mean they're going to become customers. And with I was at Astronomer, and they definitely lean very heavily in Airflow, and they provide infrastructure for your Airflow deployment. But they haven't captured like the entire market of Airflow users. There's still MWAA, there's still GCP that are competitors. So it's very tough. Everyone's trying to squeeze as much as they can from these users, and you just have to build a better product that's cheaper, which is the hard part.
So, have I you're the open source project is separate from your business, although you're clearly a big contributor to it and you were involved in the original projects. But have you had to navigate any conflicts within the community, either, I don't know, I don't wanna air dirty laundry, but, in terms of
Mhm.
interactions or, uh, differences of opinion about what should be in the project and so forth, and if you came I'm sure you came across some, everybody does, so how do you go about managing those?
Yeah, I would say it was less on the open source side, just because with Oleander, it was just naturally, uh, we were building beyond we just provide an ingestion endpoint, just like GCP and also AWS can provide. Here's an endpoint, ingest these open events. So we weren't coming in and saying you need to change the standard in some way. I think the more interesting parts were so with Datadog, they've adopted Open Lineage. So you kind of look at them and you're like, okay, are we just going to copy what they're doing, or they're going to copy with what we're doing? I think that's where I would say maybe some of the friction points happen is like, are we headed in the same direction? And if we are, uh, competing with Datadog would be very difficult, right? So that's when we sort of shifted the angle and started focusing more on ML model training and extending openness for the ML facet. I mean, for the ML use case. So when we put the standard out there or the extension of the spec, we got a lot of positive feedback. It's like, oh my God, yes, someone's actually focusing on this. I wish I could tell you there was more dirty laundry, but you definitely hear in other open source projects where it gets pretty dirty, and I won't mention any names or any projects, but there is. You have these two companies that are built off the same open source project, but they have a different direction where that goes, and that is not great. So I think maybe we're just lucky with both Marquez and Open Lineage. We kind of cultivated this community where everyone just wants to give back, and that's exactly the philosophy that we took with Oleander. We're not trying to somehow come in and say we have a we're going to take ownership of this market and we're going to own it and we're going to take control. I think it's just like, hey, let's use what we built so far, let's extend, and hopefully we can benefit from it.
Sounds like a little bit of humility goes a long way with an open source community.
It does. It does. It actually does. And maybe that just over the years you kind of learn that you can't build it yourself. So you're going to have all these different opinions, but that's also okay. Let people take ownership of of parts of the project that they really feel it compelled to contribute to, and let them run with it. So
You know
So
what?
there's always a lot of pressure to add features to open source or even commercial products. So
Mhm.
how do you decide where you're going to focus your development efforts when there are competing maybe stakeholders who want different features?
Yeah, I think that's been the most difficult with Marquez. I think I wish I could tell you that that's the because yeah, with Oleander, we're kind of building some of these core features that won't make it back to Marquez because they just can't. The vision for Marquez was always going to be the reference implementation of Open Lineage. So if you want to get up and running with Marquez, you can. And if you want to, once you get to a certain scaling point, you're gonna have to rethink about how you're going to deploy Marquez. So you'll need some Kafka ingestion layer because if you're doing a bunch of events you're going to need some sort of buffering layer. There's a lot involved there. So the architecture change as your needs change. So if you have more data pipelines running, your team's growing. That's going to it's going to introduce a bottleneck if you're just using a REST API that takes a request and writes it directly to the database. So the architecture changes. So there were things that won't make it back to to the Marquez project, but I think I haven't done the best job on putting it out there at focusing on Oleander, but also focusing on the community. And that's something I know I need to get a little bit better at. But you're only one person at sometimes. There's more contributors, obviously, in Marquez. But that's been a very difficult part. It's like there are contributions coming in and architectural changes that are being discussed. And finding the time to do that and also focusing on your own company is very, very difficult. But you need to get better at it. And I would say that even with the open source, it's also going to be its own organism in a way. It's going to have its own life cycle. So if there are features that the community wants from Marquez that actually has some overlap in Oleander, that's totally fine. You also don't want to block that. You don't know, hey, don't introduce that. Allow it to happen. And I think that's an important philosophy to take.
Going back to what you said about open source and sort of maybe, conflicts in the community and how you've been fortunate enough to avoid that. One message that we try to convey is that an underlying and perhaps often unstated principle or unstated underlying ethos of the open source community is that everybody can win, right? There can be we can live in a world where everybody wins. And that's kind of, we try to convey that still applies in the commercial open source context. And that's one of the benefits of commercial open source is that it- everybody wins. There doesn't have to be a world where, this
Mhm.
this excels at the expense of that, right? Um, so in that vein, has your journey so far, both through creating Open Lineage and Marquez and now launching Oleander, has it evolved your view of OSS or commercial or commercial OSS? Are there any sort of learnings that you've had or epiphanies that you had about open source in particular, or commercial open source in particular? And if so, how has your view evolved and, what are those epiphanies?
Wow. Put me on the spot with that one. That's a good question. Uh, I would say that well, when I was doing Oleander, I thought, and I'll be honest with you, I thought you can approach it the same way as you would an open source community, like building it out, advocating as much as you can, talking to the right people. Uh, so that's where I'm a technical founder, and my thing was always talking to engineers and kind of telling them what my vision was. When you're in sort of the startup world and you're talking to investors, it's actually a completely different environment altogether. Uh, so I think the challenges that I've faced with commercial open source and is that some people just don't necessarily want to pay. I mean, you're looking at engineers that are used to managing their own infrastructure and contributing to the open source. Uh, so you have to build. What I've learned is you have to build a far more compelling product that will provide some sort of stickiness. And I think that's what we're working towards. Um, you can contribute to open source, and that's great, and you can see adoption and people benefit from it. But with a commercial product, you have to really provide a solution to a pain point. And I think providing the product market fit, so PMF, right, is a very it's a lot more challenging than I originally thought, which is okay, which allows you to kind of evolve the product, also the vision of the company itself. Um, I wouldn't say that, I'm going after the community and looking at potential, they're all customers. That's never has been my approach to how we build out Oleander. But I think there have been a lot of challenges going from open source to then building a company around open source projects. I think it's a lot more challenging than I thought. But that only forces you to kind of iterate and pivot to get to the point where you do find a pain point that customers are willing to pay for that are also adopted your open source projects. And I view that more as a positive challenge, right? So, and that's kind of where we are. And that's how we've kind of evolved Oleander to not just be the ingestion layer for Open Lineage. And it's just Marquez behind the scenes, uh, keeping the relationships between your jobs and data sets. It's now allowed us to evolve to provide you an open lake where you can you can use SQL to execute and any query on the data sets that are in an iceberg table. So we have a SQL console that allows you to execute on those tables, and you get observability for free. You get an observability layer out of the box. So we have what do we call it? The observability first lake. And so you could come in and execute data, process it any way you want, save it within our open lake, or bring your own bucket. And that would not have happened, you know, in the commercial open source. Or I'm sorry, in the open source world. Uh, but it has allowed us to really think about how we iterate and what kind of solution we provide for end users, which is challenging. I'll put it that way. But it's also a lot of fun. And yeah, I think that's all about that.
So, I mean, you mentioned some of the challenges of transitioning from open source to commercial open source. Um, to flip that around, what are some of the opportunities or some of kind of the benefits of, have you had any moments where you just kind of it hit you that, look, this win that we just had, or this success that we just had, or this benefit that we can offer would not exist if we were not open source?
Oh, for sure. There's a few companies that we're talking to that are going to be pilots that they've already adopted Open Lineage. They've already standardized their infrastructure on Open Lineage. So when we go to a potential pilot and they're using Open Lineage, that makes the discussion a lot easier. One of our first pilots was they were called Plain Sight, and they do computer vision. And the one thing that they wanted to standardize on was open lineage. And we worked with them to build out the initial version or the initial spec of the ML facets for open lineage. So that would not have happened if they didn't want to standardize first on open lineage. And then when they found out about Oleander, they said, hey, how about do we work together? So I think there's very key things, key benefits to having data platforms already say, open lineage is the de facto standard. Now, how do you make that? How do you make them a paid pilot? That's sort of our job. But it does make the communication a lot easier.
Great. No, that's exactly those are definitely among the kind of benefits that we talk to communities about, is that, when you've established a de facto standard through your open source project, then communicating the value add of your commercial offering to your potential customers becomes that much easier. Um,
Yeah, exactly. And there's also this nice inflection point where there's some organizations are getting just big enough where they need to have a strong governance story, and they start looking at open lineage, and that's where we can help them and say, okay, you could invest 6 months, or we can you could use Oleander to compress that stack and get up and running. So if you have Spark, if you're using Flink with Kafka, if you're using Airflow, we're able to ingest those events, just enable the integration and just use an API key that Oleander provides, and we'll be able to handle that inject. We'll be your ingestion layer.
so I guess that's we're running up against the end of our time, and this has been exceptionally. Thank you so much for your insight. I want to give you a chance to, talk more about Oleander and let us know about, what's next for Oleander. What can we look forward to on the roadmap, and what are some of the cool things that you're working on right now that you can talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. And I hinted it a little bit earlier about providing more of an execution layer. So yes, if you're already using Open Lineage and you want to quickly iterate and get up and running, Oleander can provide that. We can provide that ingestion layer, and we're currently are the AI accelerator for Confluent. So we're building all of our monitoring and alerting on top of Kafka, so Confluent, right? And the interesting thing that are coming is we're going to come out with a AI copilot. So it's called Oleander AI, where you're going to be able to interact via Slack about the metadata that we've collected. So if you get a notification that your pipeline failed, or we start seeing an anomaly, you'll get a notification in Slack, and then you're going to be able to interact with our agent, which will give you just enough context to say, hey, we've identified this problem. We have a fairly strong hypothesis on why that is. And then you're able to start asking questions like, okay, what are the downstream applications or pipelines that are going to be impacted by this pipeline failing or processing more data? And so we're going to give you a breadcrumb of why the pipeline failed, as well as reasoning on why how we got to the root cause. So that's coming. So we're really excited about that. And the other thing is you're gonna be able to submit Spark jobs within our UI. And the reason for that is we just want to extend the observability layer or observability reach of Oleander. So you could come with your own Databricks cluster or Spark cluster and execute it on that, or you could use Oleander's provided cluster to run your Spark jobs. And then you're able to read and write different data sets from our telemetry lake to process data. And that's sort of the vision that we have.
Awesome, very cool. Well,
Yeah.
we wish you the best of luck with that, and uh, Willy, thank you again. This has been really, really great. We very much appreciate you sharing your time and your insight with us. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Please stay tuned. Follow us on our website, chinstrap.community, as well as our Discord server, which is linked from our website. We've got some exciting programs coming up, so please stay tuned, and thank you again.